You've been there. You send a carefully crafted important email to a colleague. Hours pass. Nothing. You follow up with a message. You see the 2 blue check marks. It's been read, and still, silence. That familiar hot feeling starts to creep up your neck. The internal monologue begins. Are they ignoring me? Do they not respect my time? This is a deliberate power play. Or maybe it's a friend who cancels plans at the last minute with a flimsy excuse. Or a driver who cuts you off in traffic without so much as a wave. In that split second, our brain doesn't just process the event. It writes a story, and almost always the villain in that story is the other person. We paint them with the brush of malice, of intentional disrespect, of calculated harm. This reaction feels automatic, justified even. It's our brain's way of protecting us. But what if this instinct, this default to suspicion, is one of the single greatest sources of unnecessary anger, anxiety, and conflict in our lives? What if most of the villains we create in our minds aren't villains at all? There is a powerful mental tool, a kind of psychological razor designed to shave away these toxic assumptions and grant you a profound sense of clarity and calm. Once you learn to use it, you will find it radically transforms how you see the world and interact with everyone in it. This is the blueprint for one of the most practical principles for modern life, Hanlon's razor. Hello and welcome to Psych Blueprint, your guide to designing a better mind. Today, we are deconstructing a mental model so simple it sounds almost trivial, yet so powerful it can diffuse conflicts before they even begin. It's called Hanlon's razor, and the principle is this: never attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by stupidity. Now, before you get offended, let's clarify. In this context, stupidity isn't an insult. It's a catch-all term, a shorthand for the entire messy, chaotic spectrum of human fallibility. It means carelessness, forgetfulness, lack of information, stress, distraction, laziness, or just plain having a bad day. Think of Hanlon's razor as a mental override switch. Our brain's default setting is often to assume the worst, to see negative intent behind negative outcomes. Hanlon's razor asks us to consciously flip that switch. Before you conclude that someone is your enemy, it forces you to first consider if they are simply overwhelmed. This isn't about being naive. It's not about letting people walk all over you. It is a strategic, deliberate choice to protect your most valuable resources, your time, your energy, and your peace of mind. It's about understanding the deep, hidden architecture of our own minds that makes us jump to the worst conclusions and then building a better system. So let's dive deep. Where did this idea come from? Why does our brain fight against it so fiercely? And how can we use it as a blueprint to architect a calmer, more effective life? Part A. The origin and definition. The what? The phrase Hanlon's razor is most directly attributed to a man named Robert J. Hanlon of Scranton, Pennsylvania. He submitted it to a joke book compilation in 1980 called Murphy's Law Book 2, More Reasons Why Things Go Wrong. It was his version of Murphy's Law, meant for the world of bureaucracy and complex projects, but the seed of the idea is much older and more profound. The great German writer and philosopher, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, wrote something remarkably similar in his 1774 novel, The Sorrows of Young Werther. His character observes, "Misunderstandings and neglect create more confusion in this world than trickery and malice." At any rate, the last two are certainly much less frequent. For over 2 centuries, great thinkers have been pointing to the same truth. We vastly overestimate the amount of deliberate evil in the world and wildly underestimate the power of simple, mundane incompetence. Let's define our terms with precision. Malice is the intent to cause harm. It requires focus, planning, and energy. It's an active process. Stupidity, on the other hand, is the passive state. It's the default. It's what happens when systems break down, when communication fails, when a person is juggling 10 different things and one of them inevitably drops. Malice is the exception, incompetence is the rule, and the core of our problem is that our brains are wired to see it the other way around. But why? Part B. The mechanism. The how. The reason we so readily assume malice lies in one of the most well-documented glitches in our mental software, the fundamental attribution error. It sounds complex, but the concept is simple. When we judge other people's behavior, we tend to attribute it to their fundamental character. That person who cut you off? They're a selfish jerk. The colleague who missed a deadline? They're lazy and unreliable. We jump straight to a conclusion about who they are, But when we do the exact same thing, we attribute our behavior to the situation. If I cut someone off, it's because I was in a hurry and didn't see them. If I miss a deadline, it's because I was overwhelmed with other tasks and the instructions weren't clear. For others, it's their flawed character. For us, it's our challenging context. This bias is a self-preservation mechanism. It protects our ego, but it consistently leads us to the most uncharitable and often incorrect conclusions about others. We see their actions in a vacuum, stripped of all the situational pressures that we so readily apply to ourselves. Now, layer on top of that the reality of modern life, cognitive load. Our brains have a finite amount of attention and processing power, a limited bandwidth. Every email, every notification, every decision, every worry consumes a piece of that bandwidth. By midday, most of us are operating with a fraction of our full mental capacity. In this state of constant, low-grade overwhelm, what is more likely? That your colleague dedicated precious mental energy to formulating a plan to deliberately undermine you by not sending a file? Or that in the chaotic whirlwind of their own 50 unanswered emails and 3 back-to-back meetings, they simply forgot? Malice requires a budget of cognitive resources. Negligence is the tax that everyone pays for living in a complex world. The fundamental attribution error is the lens that makes us misinterpret that tax as a personal attack. And when this happens on a large scale, the consequences can be catastrophic. Part C, the impact and case study. The so what? In 1999, NASA's $327 million Mars Climate Orbiter approached the Red Planet, ready to begin its mission of studying the Martian atmosphere. It was the culmination of years of work from hundreds of brilliant scientists and engineers. As the orbiter began its final maneuver to enter orbit, it passed behind Mars, and communication was temporarily lost, as expected. But it never came back. Mission Control waited, and waited. Silence. The orbiter was gone, presumed to have either burned up in the atmosphere or skipped off into deep space. What happened? Was it sabotage from a rival nation? A deep state conspiracy? A malicious act by a disgruntled employee? The malice explanations are always the most seductive. The truth was far more mundane and, in a way, far more terrifying. An investigation revealed the cause was a simple, stupid error. One team of engineers at Lockheed Martin had built the software using the imperial unit of pounds force. The other team at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory had built their software expecting the metric unit of newtons. Every time the orbiter fired its thrusters, the two systems were miscommunicating. One was pushing with the force of X pounds, and the other was interpreting it as X newtons. The tiny navigational errors accumulated over millions of miles until the spacecraft was on a fatal trajectory. It wasn't malice. It was a failure to convert units, something a high school science student is taught to do. This wasn't the fault of one stupid engineer. It was a systemic failure of oversight, communication, and assumption. Everyone assumed the other team was using the same measurements. This catastrophic failure is Hanlon's razor written across the solar system. A multi-million-dollar reminder that the most devastating outcomes often spring from the simplest, most overlooked errors, not from grand malicious designs. If a mistake this simple can destroy a Mars probe, it can certainly explain why your friend forgot to text you back. Understanding the principle is the first step. But how do we integrate it into our daily lives? How do we build a mental habit that overrides our flawed automatic programming? Here is your 4-step blueprint to becoming a master of Hanlon's razor. Strategy 1. The deliberate pause and reframe. Our emotional reaction to a perceived slight is instantaneous. The key is to insert a conscious gap between the trigger and your response. When you feel that flash of anger or hurt, take a breath. And in that moment, ask yourself one question. What are 3 other possible non-malicious explanations for this? The colleague who didn't reply? They're in a critical meeting and haven't checked their email. Your email got buried under 100 others. They saw it, intended to reply, but got pulled into an urgent task, and it slipped their mind. This exercise isn't about finding the correct explanation. It's about breaking the monopoly of your single negative malicious explanation. It forces your brain to see that other realities are possible, which immediately lowers the emotional temperature and allows you to approach the situation with curiosity instead of hostility. Strategy 2. Default to charity until proven otherwise. Think of this as changing the factory settings on your mind. Your current default might be, Assume negative intent. Your new default is assume neutral or positive intent. Instead of demanding proof of innocence, you now require proof of guilt. This means you approach the person with a problem-solving mindset, not an accusatory one, instead of, "Why did you ignore my email?" Accusation of malice. You say, "Hey, just following up on that email I sent. Wanted to make sure it didn't get lost in the shuffle." Assumption of incompetence. Yoke busyness. This simple shift in language is revolutionary. It gives the other person the benefit of the doubt, avoids making them defensive, and gets you the result you want infinitely faster than starting a conflict. You're not being weak. You are being strategic. Strategy 3. Distinguish between one-offs and patterns. This is the most critical step. Hanlon's razor is a tool for interpreting isolated incidents, not for tolerating chronic disrespect. It is not an excuse to be naive. One missed deadline is Hanlon's razor. The same person missing every deadline, forcing you to pick up the slack, is a pattern of behavior. One thoughtless comment can be explained by ignorance. A consistent stream of hurtful comments is a pattern of malice or extreme toxicity. The blueprint is simple. Apply Hanlon's razor generously on the first instance. On the second, get curious and maybe have a conversation. By the third time the same negative event occurs with the same person, you are no longer dealing with incompetence. You are dealing with a pattern. At that point, you must switch from generous interpretation to direct action, setting boundaries, having a difficult conversation, or disengaging. Strategy 4. Zoom out and examine the system. Just like with the Mars Climate Orbiter, sometimes the stupidity isn't in the person, but in the system they are forced to operate within. Before blaming an individual, ask, is the system setting them up for failure? Is your colleague unresponsive because they're lazy, or because the company has them doing the work of 3 people? Did the customer service agent give you a wrong answer because they don't care, or because their training was inadequate and their software is outdated? Seeing the systemic pressures that cause individual failures elevates Hanlon's razor from a simple interpersonal tool to a profound lens for understanding organizations and society. It moves you from blame to diagnosis, which is where real solutions are found. In the end, the true power of Hanlon's razor isn't that it makes you a more forgiving person to others. It's that it grants a profound kindness to yourself. Every time you choose to assume incompetence over malice, you are choosing to save yourself from a spike of cortisol, from a cycle of angry thoughts, from a needless conflict. You are taking back control of your own emotional state. You are refusing to let the chaotic, forgetful, and overwhelmed nature of the world dictate your inner peace. A blueprint is a plan for building something strong and functional. Our mental models are the blueprints for our lives. By choosing to build with a principle like Hanlon's razor, you are intentionally designing a life with less friction, less anger, and more space for understanding and progress. You stop being a victim of a world you believe is out to get you, and you become an architect of your own reality, a calm problem solver navigating a world that is not malevolent, just messy. The wisest people aren't those who can spot evil everywhere. They are the ones who understand that chaos is the more common enemy, and they act accordingly. So I'll leave you with a question to reflect on. Think of a recent time you were offended or angered by someone's actions. What would change if you applied Hanlon's razor to that situation right now? More importantly, share a story in the comments below about a time when choosing a more generous explanation, instead of assuming malice, completely changed a situation for you. Your story might just be the blueprint someone else needs to see today, and if this blueprint helped you design a better way of thinking, hit the like button and be sure to subscribe to Psych Blueprint. We have so much more to build together. Thanks for watching.